When my daughter-in-law announced that I was no longer welcome at Christmas dinner, I never imagined it would lead to the most transformative year of my life. Standing in their pristine marble foyer with gift bags for my 3 grandchildren in my trembling hands, I listened as Rebecca delivered the news with surgical precision. The carefully wrapped presents I'd spent weeks choosing suddenly felt like evidence of my own delusion. But when I walked into that children's hospital 2 days later, and saw the joy on those little faces as they opened the gifts meant for my own grandchildren, I discovered something my family had tried to steal from me: my worth. Follow my journey to the end, because what happened next will restore your faith in second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1, The Rejection. My name is Eleanor Patterson, and at 73 years old, I thought I understood my place in the world. For 47 years, I had been the matriarch of our family, the one who organized every holiday gathering, remembered every birthday, and kept our traditions alive through decades of change. My late husband Thomas and I had built our lives around family, around creating memories and maintaining connections that I believed would outlast us both. After Thomas passed 3 years ago, that role became even more precious to me. It was my anchor, my purpose, my reason for getting up each morning. The house on Elmwood Drive had been our family's gathering place for over 2 decades. Every Christmas Eve, the dining room table would groan under the weight of my famous honey-glazed ham, homemade cranberry sauce, and the 7-layer chocolate cake that had become as much a family tradition as opening presents on Christmas morning. The living room would fill with laughter as 3 generations crowded around the fireplace, sharing stories and creating the kind of moments that families treasure forever. But this year felt different from the moment October arrived. The usual pre-holiday phone calls from my son David seemed stilted, forced. When I mentioned Christmas plans, he would change the subject or hand the phone to one of the children. Rebecca, his wife of 15 years, had always been polite but distant with me, but lately, her coolness had turned into something that felt almost hostile. Still, I pushed forward with my preparations, telling myself that the holidays would bring us back together the way they always had. I spent weeks shopping for the perfect gifts. For 10-year-old Emma, I found a limited edition art set with professional-grade colored pencils and watercolors, knowing how she loved to paint during our afternoon visits. For 8-year-old Marcus, I discovered a science kit that promised to teach him how to grow crystals and conduct safe chemistry experiments. 7-year-old Sophie, my youngest granddaughter, had mentioned wanting a dollhouse, so I purchased an elaborate Victorian model complete with tiny furniture and miniature family figures. The gifts weren't expensive by most standards, but on my fixed income, they represented months of careful budgeting. I had eaten more canned soup and peanut butter sandwiches than I cared to count, skipped my usual weekly dinner at Romano's restaurant, and delayed replacing my worn winter coat. But seeing my grandchildren's faces light up on Christmas morning had always been worth any sacrifice. 2 weeks before Christmas, I called David to discuss the menu and timing for our traditional Christmas Eve dinner. The conversation that followed changed everything I thought I knew about my family and my place within it. Rebecca answered the phone, her voice carrying that familiar edge of impatience that had become her default tone with me over the past year. When I asked to speak with David about holiday plans, she paused for so long I wondered if the call had dropped. "Eleanor, I think we need to have a conversation," she said finally, using my first name instead of the mom she had called me for the first decade of her marriage to my son. "David and I have been talking, and we've decided to do Christmas differently this year." My heart began to pound, though I tried to keep my voice. Emma had a bedroom full of art supplies that she rarely used, while Maria treasured each new crayon like a precious gift. The contrast made me think about abundance and appreciation, about how we sometimes have to lose something to understand its true value. My next visit was to James, the 8-year-old undergoing cancer treatment. His room was larger, filled with get-well cards from his classmates back home in Ohio and photos of him playing baseball before his diagnosis. James was bald from chemotherapy, but his eyes held a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. He was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at the city below. "Hi, James," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. "I'm Eleanor. Susan told me you might like some company today." He turned toward me with a cautious smile. "Are you a new volunteer?" "I am," and I brought you something I thought you might enjoy." I handed him the science kit originally meant for Marcus, along with a book about famous scientists throughout history. James's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. He opened the kit carefully, reading every instruction with the thoroughness of someone much older. "This is so cool," he said, examining the materials for growing crystals. "I love science. I want to be a doctor when I grow up, so I can help kids like me." The maturity of his response caught me off guard. Here was a child facing one of life's most serious challenges, and his response was to want to help others in similar situations. I found myself wondering if my own grandchildren, blessed with health and security, had ever expressed such selfless ambitions. "What kind of doctor do you want to be?" I asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. "An oncologist," he said matter-of-factly. "That's what Dr. Martinez is. She's helping me get better. She says I have a really good chance because we caught my leukemia early." We spent 2 hours together that morning. James showed me his collection of baseball cards and told me about the statistics he had memorized for every player on his favorite team. He was incredibly bright, the kind of child who absorbed information like a sponge and could discuss complex topics with surprising insight. As we worked on setting up his first crystal growing experiment, he asked me thoughtful questions about my life, about why I had decided to volunteer at the hospital, about whether I had grandchildren of my own. The question about grandchildren stopped me for a moment. Technically, I did have grandchildren, but they felt more like distant relatives at this point, children whose lives I observed from the outside rather than participated in. "I do," I said carefully, "but they're growing up so fast that they don't need their grandmother as much anymore." James nodded seriously. "My grandma lives in California. She sends me letters every week with stickers and pictures of her garden. She says distance doesn't matter when you love someone." His words stayed with me as I moved on to my next visit. Little Aisha was in the room at the end of the hall, waiting for a liver transplant that could take weeks or months to materialize. At 4 years old, she was the youngest patient I had met, and she had been in the hospital the longest. Her parents were immigrants who spoke limited English, and they took turns staying with her while the other worked to maintain their small grocery store. Aisha was tiny for her age, with enormous brown eyes and a shy smile that appeared slowly when I introduced myself. I had brought her the dollhouse meant for Sophie, along with a collection of small dolls and furniture that I had purchased separately. Setting up the dollhouse on her bedside table transformed the sterile hospital room into something that felt more like a child's playroom. "Look, Aisha," I said, opening the front of the Victorian house to reveal the furnished rooms inside. "This family lives here, and they need someone to take care of them." Her eyes widened with wonder as she examined each tiny piece of furniture, each miniature family member. She was initially hesitant to touch anything, as if she feared the dollhouse might disappear if she handled it too roughly. But gradually, she began to move the dolls around, creating stories about their daily lives that revealed her longing for normalcy and home. "The mama is making dinner," she whispered, placing the mother doll in the kitchen. "The daddy is reading a story. The little girl is sleeping in her own bed." The poignancy of her play narrative wasn't lost on me. This child, who had spent months sleeping in a hospital bed, who saw her parents only in shifts, who faced an uncertain medical future, was creating stories about families living ordinary lives in their own homes. She showed me how the dollhouse family would celebrate Christmas, how they would all sit around their tiny dining room table, how they would never have to be apart. Playing with Aisha that morning taught me something profound about resilience and hope. Despite everything she was enduring, she still believed in happy endings. Her imagination was filled with visions of families staying together, of children sleeping safely in their own beds, of love that didn't depend on medical procedures or hospital schedules. Over the following weeks, I returned to the hospital every few days, always finding new ways to connect with these remarkable children. Maria and I developed a routine of afternoon art sessions where she would teach me about her favorite colors, and I would share stories about paintings I had seen in museums. James became my chess partner, patiently explaining strategies while simultaneously teaching me about the science experiments he conducted between treatments. Aisha and I created elaborate storylines for her dollhouse family, adventures that always ended with everyone safe and together. But it was during my third week of volunteering that I met the person who would change everything about my future. Dr. Catherine Wells was the head of pediatric psychology at Riverside Children's Hospital, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had been observing my interactions with the children, she explained, and was impressed by my natural ability.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The woman who had begged for a place at her family's holiday table was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered her own worth and purpose. The children I worked with didn't see me as someone's grandmother or widow or rejected family member. They saw me as Miss Eleanor, the person who helped them feel brave and strong and valued. The grant was approved in October, funding 3 additional child life specialists and expanding the program to serve the hospital's adolescent patients as well as younger children. I was promoted to senior child life specialist with responsibilities for training new staff members and developing therapeutic programs for specific patient populations. Standing in the hospital break room that October afternoon, reading the news about our grant approval, I thought about the children whose lives I had touched over the past year and the ways they had changed mine. Maria had been discharged months earlier, fully recovered from her heart surgery, but she still sent me pictures of the artwork she created at home. James was in remission and back in school in Ohio, but he emailed me regularly with updates about his science projects and baseball statistics. Aisha had received her liver transplant and was thriving, and her parents had invited me to her birthday party the following month. These children had given me something my own family had been unable or unwilling to provide: recognition of my value as an individual, appreciation for my unique contributions, and unconditional acceptance of who I was rather than disappointment in who I wasn't. They had shown me that love and connection didn't have to be conditional on meeting other people's expectations or fulfilling traditional roles. That evening, I sat in my living room updating my resume to reflect my new position and responsibilities. The woman described in that document was someone I barely recognized from a year earlier. Professional experience in child psychology and family support services. Expertise in therapeutic play and crisis intervention. Leadership role in program development and staff training. Grant writing and administrative responsibilities. It was the resume of someone who had built a meaningful career around her natural talents and passions, someone whose work made a tangible difference in the world. Looking at it, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that I had never experienced in any previous job or role, but even more importantly, I felt happy. Not the desperate, needy happiness that depended on other people's approval, but a deep, sustainable contentment that came from knowing I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The rejection that had nearly destroyed me had ultimately led me to the most fulfilling period of my entire life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 14 months after that devastating Christmas phone call that had changed everything. I was at my kitchen table, enjoying coffee and reviewing case files for the children I would be seeing that day, when I noticed the familiar handwriting on the cream-colored envelope. My heart stuttered as I recognized David's careful script, the same penmanship I had watched him develop through years of homework supervision and school projects. For a moment, I simply stared at the envelope, my coffee growing cold as conflicting emotions washed over me. Part of me had been waiting for this contact, hoping that enough time had passed for wounds to heal and perspective to develop. Another part of me dreaded opening it, afraid that any communication from my estranged family would disrupt the peace and fulfillment I had worked so hard to build. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief formal message that felt more like a business communication than a letter from my only child. "Dear Mother," it began, using the distant formality he had never employed even as an adult. "I hope this letter finds you well. Rebecca and I have been thinking about our family situation and we believe it's time to discuss some important matters. Would you be available to meet this Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock? We could come to your house, as this conversation would be better held in private. Please let me know if this time works for your schedule. Sincerely, David." The tone was so cold, so carefully neutral, that it made my chest ache. This was not the David who used to call me Mom and chat about his work, his children's accomplishments, and weekend plans. This was a stranger requesting a business meeting, someone who had to be prompted to inquire about my well-being, and who signed his name as if I might not recognize it. I spent the rest of that week alternating between anxiety and curiosity about what this meeting might entail. My colleagues at the hospital noticed my distraction, and Jennifer Martinez finally asked me directly if everything was all right. I found myself explaining the situation to her, describing the estrangement and the unexpected request for a meeting. "How do you feel about seeing them again?" she asked, her clinical training evident in the way she focused on my emotional state rather than offering immediate advice. "Honestly, terrified," I admitted. "For over a year I've built this new life where I feel valued and successful. I'm afraid that seeing them will somehow diminish that, make me feel small and insignificant again." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "That's a completely understandable fear. You've grown tremendously as a person over the past year. The Eleanor I met during training was talented but uncertain about her worth. The Eleanor sitting here now is confident, accomplished, and clear about her values. That growth doesn't disappear just because other people can't see it." Her words were reassuring, but as Saturday approached, I found myself rehearsing conversations and preparing for various scenarios. Maybe David had realized that Rebecca's ultimatum had been unfair and wanted to rebuild our relationship. Maybe the children had been asking about me and they had decided to allow supervised visits. Maybe they were facing some kind of crisis and needed my support. What I wasn't prepared for was the calculated nature of what actually transpired. David and Rebecca arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, and I was struck by how much older my son looked. At 45, he had developed lines around his eyes and gray streaks in his hair that aged him significantly. Rebecca looked as polished as always, her blonde hair styled perfectly and her designer clothes impeccable, but there was something sharp in her expression that hadn't been there before. They declined my offer of coffee or tea, choosing instead to sit stiffly on my living room couch while I settled into Thomas's old recliner across from them. The formal seating arrangement felt like a boardroom rather than a family gathering, and I could sense that whatever they had come to discuss had been carefully planned and rehearsed. "Mother," David began, his voice carrying the same distant formality as his letter, "we appreciate you agreeing to meet with us. We have some concerns that we need to address." "Concerns about what?" I asked, though something in their demeanor was already making me defensive. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. "About your recent behavior and the impact it's having on our family's reputation." The accusation caught me completely off guard. "My behavior? What are you talking about?" "We know about your job at the hospital," David said, his tone suggesting that this was somehow scandalous information. "And we know about the article." I felt my confusion deepen. "What article?" Rebecca pulled out her phone and showed me a screenshot of a newspaper article from the previous month. It was a feature story about the Children's Hospital's expanded Child Life program, with a photo of me working with a young patient and a headline that read "Local Grandmother Finds New Purpose Helping Hospitalized Children." The article described my transition from volunteer to professional staff member and highlighted the success of the programs I had helped develop. "This appeared in the Metro section of the newspaper," Rebecca said, her voice tight with disapproval. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for us?" I stared at her, genuinely bewildered. "Embarrassing? How is an article about my work embarrassing to you?" "Because it makes our family look dysfunctional," David said, his frustration evident. "The article mentions that you started volunteering after spending Christmas alone. People are drawing conclusions about why a grandmother would be alone on Christmas instead of with her family." The absurdity of their complaint began to sink in. They were upset not because I had been hurt by their rejection, but because my response to that rejection reflected poorly on them. They were more concerned about their reputation than they had ever been about my well-being. "Let me understand this correctly," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "You're upset because people might realize that you excluded me from Christmas." "We didn't exclude you," Rebecca snapped. "We made a decision about what was best for our immediate family. You're the one who turned it into a public spectacle by running to the newspaper with your sob story." "I didn't contact any newspaper. A reporter interviewed me as part of a feature about the hospital's programs. I never mentioned our family situation." "You didn't have to mention it directly," David said. "The implication is clear. And now people are asking us questions about why you weren't with family during the holidays. I felt anger beginning to build in my chest, a hot, righteous fury that I had learned to recognize and respect during my months of therapy and self-reflection. So you're here because you're socially uncomfortable, not because you miss me or want to repair our relationship. This isn't about wanting or not wanting anything, Rebecca said dismissively. This is about family obligations and appropriate behavior. You're making choices that reflect poorly on all of us. What choices exactly? David shifted uncomfortably, and I could see him gathering himself for what was clearly going to be the main thrust of their visit. Mother, we think it's time for you to consider retirement. Real retirement, not this hobby job you've created for yourself. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. A hobby job. I had spent over a year building professional skills, earning recognition from medical colleagues, and making tangible differences in children's lives, and my own son was dismissing it as a hobby. I love my work, I said simply. And I'm good at it. You're 74 years old, Rebecca said, as if this were a definitive argument. People your age should be focused on family and rest, not trying to build careers. It's unseemly. Unseemly for whom? For everyone, David said. The children are starting to ask questions about why Grandma has a job but doesn't come to family events. It's confusing for them. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The children are asking about me. Rebecca's expression tightened, and I could see that David had revealed more than they had intended. Occasionally, she said carefully, children that age don't understand adult decisions. What kinds of questions? It doesn't matter what kinds of questions. David said quickly. The point is that your choices are creating complications for us. We need you to be more thoughtful about how your actions affect the rest of the family. The manipulation was so blatant, so calculated, that it took my breath away. They were using my grandchildren's questions as leverage, implying that my professional success was somehow harmful to the children I had been forbidden to see. Have you considered that maybe the children's questions suggest they miss having a relationship with me? I asked. What the children need, Rebecca said firmly, is stability and clarity. They need to understand that their nuclear family is their priority, and that extended family relationships are secondary. So what exactly are you proposing? David and Rebecca exchanged a look, and I could see them moving into the phase of this conversation they had clearly rehearsed most thoroughly. We think you should quit your job and focus on activities that are more appropriate for someone your age, David said. Volunteer work is fine, but this professional position is creating too much attention and too many complications. And in return we would be willing to consider some limited family contact. Rebecca said, perhaps holiday visits, supervised interactions with the children, but only if you demonstrate that you understand your proper role in our family structure. The quid pro quo was laid out with stunning clarity. Give up my career, my sense of purpose, my professional identity, and in exchange I might be allowed supervised visits with my own grandchildren. Submit to their vision of what was appropriate for someone my age, and they might graciously permit me to exist on the periphery of their lives. I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved and supported through every challenge of his life, and realized that I barely recognized him. The David I had known would never have participated in such a cold, manipulative ultimatum. But then again, maybe I had never really known him at all. Maybe I had been so focused on loving him unconditionally that I had failed to see the entitled, controlling person he had become. I need to think about this, I said finally. There's really nothing to think about, Rebecca said. Either you care about maintaining a relationship with your family, or you don't. Either you're willing to make reasonable compromises, or you're not. What I need to think about, I said, my voice gaining strength, is whether I want a relationship with people who view my professional accomplishments as embarrassments to be managed. David's face flushed. That's not what we're saying. That's exactly what you're saying. You're asking me to give up work that fulfills me and helps children because it makes you uncomfortable socially. You're treating my career like it's some kind of acting out that needs to be corrected. Your career. Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. Eleanor, you work part-time at a hospital. It's not a career, it's a distraction from the real issues in your life. What real issues? The fact that you're alone, the fact that you're aging, The fact that you need family support more than you need professional validation. Her words hit like physical blows, aimed precisely at the insecurities I had struggled with for years. But instead of crumbling under them, I felt something crystallize inside me. These people were never going to value what I had built or respect who I had become. They wanted me to remain the smaller version of myself, the one who existed primarily to serve their needs and validate their choices. I think this conversation is over, I said, standing up from my chair. Mother, don't be dramatic, David said. We're trying to help you. You're trying to control me. There's a difference. We're trying to maintain family relationships, Rebecca said, also standing. But we can't do that if you continue to prioritize strangers over your own family. I'm not prioritizing strangers. I'm prioritizing my own well-being and sense of purpose, something you've never seemed particularly concerned about. David moved toward the door, his frustration evident. Fine, we've made our offer. When you're ready to be reasonable about this, you know how to reach us. After they left, I sat in my living room trying to process what had just happened. They had come to my home not to reconcile or apologize, but to deliver an ultimatum designed to force me back into a subordinate role. They wanted me to give up everything I had built, so that they could control the narrative about our family situation. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. They had essentially confirmed that the children were asking about me, suggesting that my absence was noticeable and potentially distressing to them. But instead of using that information to bridge our estrangement, they were using it as leverage to force my compliance with their demands. That evening, I called Jennifer Martinez and asked if she had time to talk. Over dinner at a quiet restaurant, I described the meeting and the ultimatum I had been given. It sounds like they're feeling threatened by your independence and success, she said thoughtfully. People who are comfortable with their own lives don't typically feel the need to control other people's choices so intensively. But what if they're right about the children missing me? What if my stubbornness is preventing relationships that could be meaningful for all of us? Jennifer was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Eleanor, in my experience, relationships built on ultimatums and conditional acceptance rarely turn out to be healthy for anyone involved. If they wanted to rebuild a relationship with you, they would have led with love and respect, not demands and threats. Over the following weeks, I found myself analyzing every aspect of the conversation, looking for signs that I might have misunderstood their intentions or overreacted to their proposals. But the more I thought about it, the more clearly I could see the manipulation tactics they had employed. They had started with criticism of my behavior, framing my success as socially embarrassing. They had moved to emotional manipulation, using my grandchildren's questions as leverage. They had offered a conditional reward, limited family contact in exchange for compliance. And they had ended with implied threats, suggesting that my refusal to cooperate would result in permanent estrangement. It was a textbook example of coercive control, designed to force me back into a subordinate position where they could dictate the terms of my existence. The fact that it was coming from my own family made it more painful, but it didn't make it less manipulative. 3 weeks after their visit, I received another letter from David. This one was even shorter and more formal than the first. Dear Mother, since we haven't heard from you regarding our discussion, we assume you have decided to prioritize your job over family relationships. We want you to know that the children have stopped asking about you, and we think it's better that way. Please don't contact us unless you're ready to make the changes we discussed. Sincerely, David. The cruelty of that letter took my breath away. They were using my grandchildren as weapons, claiming that the children had stopped missing me as a way to punish me for refusing their ultimatum. They were essentially saying that if I didn't submit to their demands, I would lose access to the next generation of my family permanently. But even as the letter devastated me emotionally, I could see it for what it was, a final manipulation attempt designed to break my resolve. They were counting on my love for my grandchildren to override my self-respect and force me back into compliance. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Reading David's cold, calculated words, I realized that these people had never actually loved me unconditionally. Their affection had always been contingent on my usefulness to them, my willingness to play the role they had assigned me. When I had stopped being useful in the way they preferred and had started building an independent life, they had tried to destroy it. The next morning, I threw David's letter away without writing a response. I had no intention of playing their game anymore. of negotiating for scraps of affection from people who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be valued. At work that day, I threw myself into my responsibilities with renewed energy. I was scheduled to work with a new patient, a 12-year-old girl named Sarah, who had been in a serious accident and was struggling with depression and anxiety about her recovery. Her case was complicated because her injuries would require months of physical therapy and multiple surgeries, and she was refusing to participate in her treatment plan. Working with Sarah reminded me of why my job mattered in ways that went far beyond family approval or social acceptability. This child needed someone who could help her find hope and strength during the darkest period of her young life. She needed someone who would see her potential rather than just her problems, someone who would believe in her capacity to heal and grow. Over the following weeks, Sarah and I developed a therapeutic relationship that helped her begin to engage with her medical treatment. We created art projects that allowed her to express her fears and frustrations about her injuries. We worked on goal-setting exercises that helped her envision a future beyond her current struggles. Most importantly, we talked about resilience and the ways that people could survive difficult circumstances and emerge stronger. Helping Sarah navigate her recovery process reminded me that my work was about much more than my own fulfillment. It was about being present for people during their most vulnerable moments, offering hope when they couldn't find it themselves, and helping them discover strength they didn't know they possessed. The recognition I received for my work with Sarah led to another professional opportunity. The hospital's administration asked me to develop a training program for new child life specialists, sharing the techniques and approaches that had proven most effective in my practice. It meant additional responsibilities and a significant salary increase, but more importantly, it meant that my methods and insights would be passed on to other professionals who would help thousands of additional children. Standing in the conference room where I would be conducting the training sessions, looking out at the eager faces of new staff members who wanted to learn from my experience, I felt a profound sense of purpose and accomplishment. These people saw me as an expert, someone whose knowledge and skills were valuable enough to be formally transmitted to others. The contrast between this professional recognition and my family's dismissive attitude toward my work was stark and illuminating. My colleagues valued my contributions and wanted to learn from me. My family saw my professional success as an embarrassment to be hidden. 6 months after David and Rebecca's ultimatum, I received a phone call that brought their manipulation tactics into even sharper focus. Dr. Wells called me into her office to discuss a concerning situation. "Eleanor, I need to tell you about a conversation I had yesterday," she said, her expression serious. "A woman called claiming to be your daughter-in-law. She was asking questions about your employment here, specifically about whether your job was putting undue stress on you and whether we had concerns about your ability to handle the responsibilities." My stomach dropped. What did you tell her? I told her that I couldn't discuss personnel matters with someone who wasn't authorized to receive that information. But Eleanor, the conversation was concerning. She was clearly fishing for information that could be used to undermine your position here. The revelation that Rebecca had contacted my workplace in an attempt to sabotage my career was shocking even by the standards of manipulation I had come to expect from them. They weren't content to try to pressure me directly, they were actively working to destroy the professional life I had built. She also mentioned something about family concerns regarding your mental health, Dr. Wells continued carefully. Again, I told her that such concerns would need to be addressed through proper channels if they were legitimate. But I wanted you to be aware that someone is apparently trying to create problems for you professionally. I felt a cold fury unlike anything I had ever experienced. They were trying to destroy my career by implying that I was mentally unfit for my responsibilities. They were attempting to weaponize my workplace against me, hoping that manufactured concerns about my competence would force me out of the job they wanted me to quit. "Is my position here secure?" I asked. "Absolutely," Dr. Wells said firmly. "Your work speaks for itself, and we have no concerns whatsoever about your performance or mental health. But I thought you should know that someone is actively working against your interests." That evening, I sat in my home office and wrote a letter that I had been avoiding for months. Not to David and Rebecca, but to my grandchildren. I knew they might never receive it, but I needed to create a record of my love for them and my side of the story, something they could read someday when they were old enough to understand the complexities of adult relationships. In the letter, I told them about my work at the hospital, about the children I had helped, and the meaningful contributions I was making to the world. I explained that I had tried to maintain our relationship, but that their parents had made demands that would have required me to give up my sense of purpose and self-worth. I told them that I loved them unconditionally and would always be available to them if they chose to seek me out as adults. Most importantly, I told them that sometimes loving someone means refusing to enable their worst behaviors, even when that refusal comes at great personal cost. I told them that I hoped they would grow up to be people who valued others for their authentic selves, rather than for their willingness to conform to external expectations. Writing that letter felt like both a goodbye and a liberation. I was acknowledging that my relationship with my grandchildren might be permanently damaged by their parents' manipulation, but I was also refusing to compromise my integrity in order to preserve access to them. The next morning, I sealed the letter and put it in my safety deposit box, along with copies of the newspaper articles about my work and documentation of my professional achievements. Someday, if my grandchildren wanted to understand what had really happened during these years, they would have access to the truth, rather than just the version their parents had constructed. But I was done trying to prove my worth to people who had decided not to value it. I was done negotiating for crumbs of affection from people who saw my happiness as a threat to their control. I was done allowing fear of rejection to prevent me from living authentically. My family had made their choice about what kind of relationship they wanted with me. Now I was making mine about what kind of life I wanted to build without them. 2 years later, I stood on the stage of the National Children's Hospital Association conference, looking out at an audience of over 800 healthcare professionals from across the country. The presentation I was about to deliver was titled Innovative Therapeutic Approaches in Pediatric Care, Building Resilience Through Creative Intervention, and it represented the culmination of everything I had learned and accomplished since that devastating Christmas rejection that now felt like a lifetime ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being recognized as a national expert in my field at age 76, when my own family had dismissed my work as an embarrassing hobby. The program director introducing me rattled off my credentials and achievements with obvious admiration, describing the groundbreaking programs I had developed and the hundreds of children whose lives had been transformed through my interventions. As I approached the podium, I caught sight of myself in the large screen that would project my image to the back of the auditorium. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the broken, pleading grandmother who had stood on David and Rebecca's doorstep with unwanted Christmas gifts 3 years earlier. This woman stood tall and confident, wearing a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority and competence. Her silver hair was styled professionally, her posture spoke of self-assurance, and her eyes held the wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and emerging stronger. My presentation went flawlessly, drawing sustained applause and a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. During the question and answer session that followed, pediatric psychologists and child life specialists from some of the most prestigious hospitals in the country sought my advice on complex cases and program development strategies. These were people at the top of their field, and they were treating me as a peer whose expertise they valued and respected. After the conference, I was approached by a literary agent who had been in the audience. She was interested in representing me for a book about my work with hospitalized children, specifically focusing on the therapeutic techniques I had pioneered. The book proposal she outlined would position me as a leading voice in pediatric emotional care, someone whose insights could influence practice standards across the healthcare industry. Sitting in my hotel room that evening, reviewing the contract she had presented, I marveled at how completely my life had transformed. The woman who had once begged for acceptance from people who saw her as a burden was now being courted by publishers who recognized her expertise as valuable intellectual property. But the real validation came not from professional accolades or publishing opportunities, but from the daily work itself. Every morning when I walked into Riverside Children's Hospital, I was greeted by colleagues who genuinely appreciated my contributions and children whose faces lit up when they saw me coming down the hall. The relationships I had built were based on mutual respect and authentic connection, rather than obligation and conditional acceptance. The children I worked with had taught me profound lessons about resilience, courage, and the capacity to find joy even in the most challenging circumstances. 8-year-old Michael, who was undergoing treatment for a rare genetic disorder, had become my chess mentor, patiently teaching me advanced strategies while simultaneously managing pain and uncertainty that would have broken many adults. 11-year-old Zara, recovering from a serious accident, had collaborated with me on developing a therapeutic art program that was now being replicated at hospitals throughout the region. These children didn't see me as someone's grandmother, or someone's mother, or someone's anything. They saw me as Miss Eleanor, the person who helped them feel brave and creative and hopeful. Their acceptance of me was uncomplicated and unconditional, based simply on how I treated them and what I brought to their lives. 6 months after the conference, my book Healing Through Connection, A Child Life Specialist's Guide to Therapeutic Relationships was published by a major medical press. The launch event was held at a bookstore near the hospital, and I was amazed by the turnout. Colleagues from work, former patients and their families, medical professionals from other institutions, and community members who had read about my work all came to show their support. Dr. Wells introduced me to the crowd with words that still make me emotional to remember. Eleanor Patterson represents the very best of what healthcare can be when we remember that healing involves much more than medical procedures. She has shown us that therapeutic relationships built on genuine caring and respect can transform not just individual lives, but entire approaches to patient care. She is a pioneer, a mentor, and an inspiration to everyone who has had the privilege of working with her. As I signed books that evening, I was struck by the diversity of people who had come to celebrate this milestone with me. There were medical residents who had learned from my training programs, parents whose children I had helped during their most frightening moments, and community members who had been inspired by newspaper articles about my work. These people saw me as I had never been seen before, as someone whose contributions mattered, whose expertise was valuable, and whose presence in the world made a measurable difference. Among the well-wishers that evening was an unexpected face. Patricia Hendress, the woman whose gossip about my coffee date with Harrison had initially triggered Marin's interference, approached me near the end of the event. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind me coming," she said, looking genuinely contrite. "I wanted to congratulate you on your book, but more than that, I wanted to apologize." I was genuinely surprised by her presence and her words. "Apologize for what, Patricia?" "For my part in the situation with your family. I know that my gossiping about seeing you with that gentleman caused problems for you. At the time I thought I was just sharing neighborhood news, but I realize now that I was interfering in your personal life in a way that wasn't appropriate." Her apology was unexpected and frankly unnecessary. Patricia's gossip had set certain events in motion, but the fundamental problems in my relationship with David and Rebecca had existed long before that coffee date. Still, I appreciated her acknowledgement of her role in the situation. "Thank you for saying that, Patricia, but honestly I think things would have unfolded the same way regardless. The issues with my family went much deeper than gossip." She nodded thoughtfully. "I've heard through various sources about how they've treated you since then. It's shameful, really. You've accomplished so much, and instead of being proud of you, they've tried to tear you down." Her comment made me realize how much the community perception of my situation had shifted over the years. Initially, some people might have wondered why a grandmother was working instead of focusing on family. But as my professional achievements became more visible, and the true nature of my family's rejection became apparent, public opinion had clearly moved in my direction. "Are you happy, Eleanor?" Patricia asked as she prepared to leave. "I mean really happy." The question caught me off guard because it was so direct and personal, but the answer came easily. "Yes, Patricia, I'm happier than I've ever been in my adult life." And it was true. Despite the pain of losing my relationship with my grandchildren, despite the ongoing hurt of being rejected by my only child, I had found a level of contentment and fulfillment that I had never experienced before. My work gave me purpose, my colleagues respected me, and I had built a life that felt authentically mine, rather than one designed to meet other people's expectations. That happiness was tested 1 month later, when I received news that I had been both expecting and dreading. Susan from the hospital's volunteer office called to tell me that she had received an inquiry about volunteer opportunities from a woman named Emma Patterson. She's 15 years old, Susan explained, and she's interested in our art therapy program. She specifically asked about working with Miss Eleanor because she'd heard wonderful things about your work with children. My heart stopped. Emma Patterson, my granddaughter now 15 years old, had somehow learned about my work and was trying to make contact. The child I hadn't seen in over 3 years, who had supposedly stopped asking about me according to her father's cruel letter, was attempting to reconnect through my professional life. "What did you tell her?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. I told her that we'd be happy to discuss volunteer opportunities, but that she would need parental permission to participate in our programs. She said she would handle getting the necessary paperwork. I spent the next week in an agony of anticipation and anxiety. Was this Emma's idea, or were David and Rebecca orchestrating some new manipulation? Had she genuinely missed me and wanted to rebuild our relationship, or was this part of some larger scheme to draw me back into their dysfunctional dynamic? The answer came when Emma appeared at my office door the following Thursday afternoon. She had grown tall and beautiful, with long brown hair and Thomas's distinctive green eyes. She was dressed in jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, looking like any other teenager, but there was something in her expression that seemed older than her 15 years. "Hi Grandma Eleanor," she said quietly, using a combination of formal and familiar address that perfectly captured the awkwardness of our situation. "Hello Emma," I replied, my throat tight with emotion. "I'm surprised to see you here. I know, I probably should have called first, but I wasn't sure you'd want to talk to me." The uncertainty in her voice broke my heart. This child thought I might not want to talk to her, when nothing could have been further from the truth. "Of course I want to talk to you. Please, come sit down." She settled into the chair across from my desk, looking around at the awards and certificates on my walls with obvious curiosity. "Mom and Dad don't know I'm here," she said finally. "They think I'm at soccer practice." The revelation that she was here without their knowledge confirmed my suspicion that this wasn't part of any parental manipulation. This was a 15-year-old girl who had made her own decision to reach out to the grandmother she had been separated from for 3 years. "How did you know where to find me?" I asked. "I Googled you," she said with the matter-of-fact tone that only teenagers could manage. "I found the newspaper articles about your work here, and the announcement about your book. I had no idea you were so famous." Famous was certainly an overstatement, but I was touched by the obvious pride in her voice. "I'm not famous, sweetheart. I just found work that I love and that seems to help people. The articles made it sound like you're really important here, like you've created all these new programs and helped hundreds of kids." She paused, then looked directly at me. "Why didn't anyone tell me you were doing all this amazing stuff?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications about what her parents had and hadn't shared about my life since our estrangement. I chose my words carefully, not wanting to put her in the middle of adult conflicts but also not wanting to lie to her. "Your parents and I have had some disagreements about how to maintain family relationships," I said diplomatically. "Sometimes when adults are upset with each other, they don't share information that they probably should." Emma nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. "They told us you were too busy with your job to spend time with family. But Marcus said that didn't make sense because you used to always make time for us before." The mention of Marcus, now 11 years old, made my chest ache. These children had been trying to make sense of my sudden absence from their lives with limited and apparently misleading information from their parents. "I would never be too busy for you kids," I said firmly. "My work is important to me, but you will always be more important." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I missed you so much, Grandma. Christmas hasn't been the same without you. And birthdays. And just regular times when I wanted to talk to someone who understood me." I stood up and moved around my desk to embrace her, both of us crying now. She felt different in my arms, taller and more mature, but also fundamentally the same little girl I had loved since the day she was born. "I missed you too, sweetheart, more than you could possibly know." We spent the next 2 hours talking, with Emma filling me in on 3 years of her life that I had missed. She had become an accomplished artist, which didn't surprise me given her early aptitude with the art supplies I used to bring her. She was struggling with anxiety about high school social dynamics, which was entirely normal for her age. Most significantly, she had been thinking seriously about careers in healthcare, inspired partly by curiosity about the work I was doing. Could I really volunteer here? She asked as our visit was drawing to a close. I mean, if I got permission from Mom and Dad. If you're genuinely interested in the work and if your parents approve, then yes, I think we could arrange something, I said carefully. But Emma, I want you to be sure this is what you want to do, not something you're doing just to spend time with me. It's both, she said honestly. I want to spend time with you, but I also really want to learn about helping kids who are going through hard times. Some of my friends have had to deal with serious stuff, and I've seen how important it is to have adults who really understand. Her maturity impressed me. This wasn't a child acting on impulse, but a young woman who had given serious thought to her interests and goals. There's something you need to understand, I said gently. If you decide to pursue this, it might create complications with your parents. They might not be happy that you reached out to me without their permission. Emma's expression hardened in a way that reminded me of myself when I had finally decided to stop accepting my family's manipulation. Grandma, I'm 15 years old. I'm smart enough to decide who I want to have relationships with. If Mom and Dad can't handle that, it's their problem, not mine. 2 weeks later, Emma returned with signed permission forms and a determination that impressed everyone she met at the hospital. Her parents had apparently agreed to let her volunteer, though Emma reported that the conversation had been intense and that they had imposed several conditions about when and how she could participate in the program. Working with my granddaughter in a professional context was both wonderful and complicated. She was genuinely gifted at connecting with younger children, showing a natural empathy and creativity that reminded me of myself at her age. But she also brought a level of emotional complexity to our relationship that required careful navigation. During quiet moments between patients, Emma would ask me questions about our family situation that were difficult to answer honestly without crossing appropriate boundaries. She was clearly trying to understand what had happened between her parents and me, and she was intelligent enough to recognize that the explanation she had been given didn't align with the evidence of my successful, meaningful life. Grandma, she said one afternoon as we were cleaning up art supplies,